Imagine this. It's 1932. The Great Depression is grinding the world into dust. Empires are teetering. Politicians are panicking. And somewhere in the wide, sun-blasted emptiness of Western Australia, a group of soldiers prepares for war. They have uniforms. They have machine guns. They have trucks. They have a mission. Their enemy, a bird. Not just any bird. The emu, a creature that cannot fly, refuses to reason, and runs like a feathery panic attack on stilts. This is not a metaphor. This is not a cartoon. This is an actual event recorded in government reports, complete with dates, casualty estimates, and strategic assessments that read like a Monty Python sketch performed by people who didn't realize it was supposed to be funny. The year 1932 will forever be remembered, or at least politely giggled about, as the time Australia declared war on emus and lost. You're listening to Sleepy Dreamer in America, where we drift through the stranger corners of history with the calm, weary amusement of someone watching humanity trip over its own shoelaces. Again, and tonight's story may just be the most gloriously unnecessary conflict ever waged. A war fought with real guns, real soldiers, and absolutely no victories. Against an opponent that weighed 40 kilos, could sprint at 30 miles an hour, and had absolutely no idea it was at war. But before we get to the gunfire and the feathers, we must understand the background, because like all ridiculous human ventures, this one began with something quite serious: economics. Australia in the early 1930s was not doing great. The Great Depression hit farmers like a dropped piano. Wheat prices had plummeted. The government was broke. Promises were cheap. And optimism had gone extinct. And into this delicate ecosystem of despair waddled the emus, tens of thousands. Of them, they had no respect for human suffering. They had no grasp of international finance. They just saw endless fields of newly planted wheat and thought, oh, buffet. They came in waves, migrating from the interior in search of food and water after the breeding season. Farmers looked out across their fields and saw what appeared to be a slow-moving, feathered apocalypse. Stalks of wheat were flattened, fences were destroyed, and crops vanished beneath a tide of bouncing bird butts. For the struggling farmers, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. The emus weren't just stealing their food, they were mocking the very concept of civilization. So the farmers did what farmers in the early 20th century often did when faced with a problem. They asked the government to shoot it. And remarkably, the government agreed. Enter Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, a man whose title alone promised competence and dignity, both of which would soon be in short supply. He was assigned a small detachment of soldiers armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The mission was simple: go out there, find the emus, and restore humanity's dominance over the agricultural landscape. It was, by all accounts, the world's least necessary military operation, but also one of its most confident. The Australian Minister of Defence approved the plan without irony, and the press loved it. Newspaper headlines practically wrote themselves: government, declares war on emus. Army mobilizes against bird menace. Victory assured. Spoiler alert, victory was not assured. What followed was not so much a war as a long, awkward embarrassment stretched over several weeks and several hundred wasted bullets. The soldiers headed out to the wheat belt near Cambion, Western Australia. Their opponents, as previously mentioned, were flightless birds. They had no weapons, no leadership, no banners, and no discernible strategy beyond run. But as it turned out, that was enough. The first encounter came on November 2nd, 1932. Major Meredith and his men spotted a group of about 50 emus. The troops crept into position, set up the Lewis guns, and waited. The birds approached. The soldiers opened fire. The machine gun jammed. The emus scattered. The first battle of the Great Emu War lasted about 30 seconds and ended with 0. Emu casualties and one wounded sense of national pride. Undeterred, Major Meredith regrouped. Perhaps they had simply chosen the wrong time, the wrong angle, the wrong flock. He decided to adapt his tactics, because that's what great military leaders do. They learn from failure. The next day, he ambushed a larger group, 1,000 birds this time. Perfect target, surely. Surely this would be the decisive moment. The machine gun overheated after a few dozen rounds. The emus fled in all directions, which, as it turns out, is a great defense against bullets. Witnesses described it as chaos, feathers, dust, and human shouting, the sound of imperial dignity dissolving in real-time dot by the end of the day. The soldiers had killed perhaps a dozen emus, maybe out of tens of thousands. If you're keeping score, that's roughly 1 bird per 100 bullets. Not exactly a military triumph. But let's not be too harsh. The Australians were professionals. They didn't quit easily. They simply reclassified their defeats as strategic withdrawals and tried again. And again. And the emus just kept running, gloriously unbothered, blissfully unaware that they were now technically at war. There's something oddly comforting about that dot, because sometimes, even in the middle of humanity's strangest plans, nature just refuses to take us seriously. After the first few humiliations, Major Meredith did what any good commander does when faced with a superior enemy. He blamed logistics. The terrain, he explained, was difficult. The birds were fast, the guns were heavy, and besides, it was windy dot this was, technically. All true. The wheat fields of Western Australia weren't exactly ideal for coordinated infantry maneuvers, especially when the enemy was made of legs and chaos. So Meredith came up with a new plan: mobility. If the birds were too fast, he would make the army faster, enter the trucks. The soldiers mounted one of their Lewis machine guns on the back of a flatbed truck and prepared to chase the emus down across the open plains. A bold strategy that looked incredible on paper, provided one didn't think too hard about the physics of shooting a fast-moving target from another fast-moving target across uneven terrain while holding on for dear life. Spoiler, it did not go well. The first attempt ended when the truck hit. A bump, The gunner nearly fell out, and the emus effortlessly outran the vehicle. You see, emus can run up to 30 miles per hour. The trucks, weighed down with men and ammunition, could not, so the soldiers ended up lurching along behind a cloud of dust, occasionally firing bursts into the horizon while the emus vanished over the next ridge. One witness described the scene as like watching a drunk kangaroo try to operate a sewing machine. After that, the troops abandoned the trucks and returned to ambushes. But ambushing emus proved complicated. For one thing, emus have excellent eyesight. They can spot danger from hundreds of meters away. For another, they travel in usually coordinated flocks, not tightly packed, but spread out, moving like waves. By the time soldiers fired into one group, another would scatter behind them, and within seconds, the field would be empty except for trampled wheat and human frustration. Major Meredith, to his credit, did not immediately resign. He wrote reports. He analyzed patterns. He noted, with surprising admiration, that the emus appeared to employ some kind of guerrilla strategy. Each group, he wrote, seems to have its own leader, a great black-plumed bird which stands sentry and warns the others of our approach, which is a polite military way of saying the birds are winning. The newspapers, of course, loved this. Headlines blared, emus outwit army, troops routed by bird foe. Feathered menace laughs at modern warfare. Cartoonists had a field day. Politicians tried to ignore it. Australia's farmers, however, were less amused. Their crops were still being destroyed, and they didn't particularly care whether the soldiers looked ridiculous. They just wanted the emus gone. So the government authorized a continuation of the campaign. More ammunition was sent. More days passed. More bullets were fired. And still, the birds endured. By late November, morale was collapsing. The troops had fired over 2,500 rounds and killed, by their own generous estimate, maybe 200 emus. That's roughly one confirmed hit per 12 bullets. Not a ratio likely to impress anyone except the emus. The birds, meanwhile, continued their advance. Farmers reported that the flocks seemed even more numerous than before. One soldier reportedly muttered, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." And that, really, was the tone of the entire war. A bizarre mixture of frustration, admiration, and disbelief. By early December, after several weeks of humiliation, Major Meredith and his men were recalled. The operation was quietly shut down. The official reason was that it was costing too much. The unofficial reason was that it was costing too much dignity. The emus had won. There was no surrender ceremony. The birds refused to sign any treaties. But the outcome was clear. The Australian military had been bested by a species with a brain smaller than a walnut. And yet, as with all great historical defeats, the post-war commentary was immediate and intense. Politicians debated whether the operation had been worthwhile. One senator suggested that perhaps the birds had not been properly targeted due to insufficient planning. Another pointed out that the emus, being native Australian citizens, could technically not be classified as enemy combatants. Someone else proposed building a giant fence which, to the astonishment of no one, turned out to be a much more effective solution. But the legend of the Great Emu War was already taking shape. People laughed about it, yes, but there was something irresistibly symbolic about it too. A tiny, absurd parable of modern humanity's ongoing attempt to control nature, only to find that nature, when mildly inconvenienced, simply runs faster. And for the farmers who had watched their livelihoods trampled by thousands of happy, oblivious birds, it was hard to see the humor. The government, after all, had promised them protection. They had gotten a slapstick routine instead. So, like all wars, the Great Emu War left wounds, emotional, agricultural, and existential. The military moved on. The politicians pretended it had never happened. And the emus just kept running. In the aftermath of the Great Emu War, there was an awkward silence across the Australian government. The kind of silence that usually follows when someone tries to explain how a heavily armed national military lost to a flock of oversized chickens. Reports were written, summaries were filed. Most of them used the polite language of bureaucracy, the kind that can describe a catastrophic failure without ever using the word failure. One official memo noted that further operations are not recommended due to logistical inefficiencies. Another simply said, the birds appear to have a strong survival instinct. That's one way to put it. Major Meredith himself returned to base, feathers in his cap metaphorically and literally, his dignity somewhere on the open plains. He was not court-martialed, of course. Nobody had expected this to become a proper war. But he did become, briefly, famous, a sort of tragic hero of rural absurdity. He even gave a few interviews. In one, he observed, with what sounded suspiciously like professional respect, that the emus displayed extraordinary agility, even when wounded. He went on, if we had an army of emus, we could face any force in the world. You could hear the mixture of frustration and admiration. The birds had, against all odds, done something almost human. They had refused to cooperate with a plan. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the farmers continued to battle the real consequences. The emus, emboldened by victory, seemed to multiply. Their numbers swelled into the tens of thousands. They trampled fences, devoured wheat, and strutted about the farmland like tiny, triumphant warlords. And so, the farmers petitioned the government again. Because when at first you don't succeed, you might as well try the exact same thing and hope the birds have gotten lazier. So in late 1934, a new emu control campaign was authorized. But this time, it was not declared a war. No uniforms, no fanfare, just quiet, practical extermination efforts, backed by better coordination with local farmers. It still didn't go smoothly. Nothing about shooting emus ever does. But it at least avoided the level of national embarrassment that came with official headlines. And, eventually, more fences were built. Long, sturdy barriers stretching across the wheat belt. These did what bullets could not. They kept the emus mostly out. Mostly because As every farmer learns eventually, mostly is the best you can ever do. As for the broader public, the Great Emu War faded into legend almost immediately. People began telling the story at pubs, often with embellishments. By the 1940s, it was already half folklore. Did you know the army once fought birds and lost? The absurdity was too good to ignore, and yet, under all the laughter, there lingered something quietly serious. The whole debacle had exposed not just the stubbornness of emus, but the fragility of human order. How easily our grand plans can collapse into chaos when nature decides to improvise. It wasn't just a funny anecdote about incompetent soldiers. It was a reminder that even the might of an empire can be humbled by something as silly as a bird that refuses to cooperate. There's a certain poetic justice in that. Humanity has spent centuries trying to dominate nature. We've drained swamps, leveled forests, dammed rivers, rearranged entire ecosystems, and yet, over and over again, some small, ridiculous creature manages to ruin everything. The emus were not trying to make a point. They were just being emus. But somehow, their simple persistence became a kind of rebellion, not against farmers or governments, but against the very idea that the world can ever be fully controlled. It's no wonder people love this story. It's comforting, in a way. It reassures us that when the world feels too heavy, too mechanical, too ordered, there's still something wild and hilariously defiant out there, reminding us that nature always gets the last laugh. And for Australia, a country already defined by its chaotic wildlife, the Great Emu War became something of a national inside joke. Only in Australia, people would say, shaking their heads, only here would the birds win. School children learned about it as a funny story in textbooks. Historians tucked it into footnotes with wry commentary. Filmmakers and comedians later resurrected it as a cultural gem, the perfect metaphor for human hubris wrapped in feathers. Because really, what could be more human than declaring war on nature, and then being soundly defeated by it? Over the years, the Great Emu War became not just a historical curiosity, but a mirror. Every retelling says more about the teller than the birds themselves. To the soldiers, it was a memory of futility. To the farmers, it was a story of desperation. To historians, it was an emblem of colonial absurdity. To comedians, it was perfect. And to dreamers like us, here, drifting into sleep, it's a strangely soothing parable about limits, humility, and the quiet, stubborn persistence of life itself. Because while governments rise and fall, while wars rage and fade into dust, the emus keep walking across the plains, indifferent, eternal, free. There's something almost sacred in that. Picture, if you will, a tired Australian soldier in 1932. He's standing in the middle of a field that smells faintly of wheat, gunpowder, and humiliation. His boots are muddy. His Lewis gun has jammed again. His commanding officer is muttering something about avian insurgents. And out there, on the horizon, hundreds of emus are watching. Now, the thing about being watched by emus is that it's deeply unsettling. They don't blink. They don't flinch. They just stare, as if trying to figure out whether you're dangerous or edible. That soldier, bless him, probably didn't sign up for this. He might have dreamed of glory, medals, parades, perhaps a stirring march played in his honor. Instead, he got a bird staring contest in the outback, and as more and more soldiers found themselves involved in this feathered fiasco, something began to shift. The mood turned philosophical. What? One gunner allegedly asked, "Are we doing?" That's the question that always creeps in when civilization meets absurdity head-on. When you're in a truck, bouncing across the dirt, chasing a bird with a machine gun, you eventually have to stop and reconsider your life choices. The press, meanwhile, couldn't resist. Reporters showed up at the battlefront, and yes, they called it a battlefront to witness this military marvel. What they found was a handful of exhausted men firing wildly into the distance while emus darted between bushes, completely unbothered. One journalist described it as an engagement in which the enemy's casualties are uncertain, and the soldier's dignity is definitely wounded. Soon, newspapers were running headlines like "Army loses to birds and feathered foes foil firepower." There was laughter in the cities, but not the good kind. The kind that makes politicians sweat. Parliament, of course, debated it. They had to. You can't just have an unannounced war against wildlife and not talk about it. But their discussions were delicate, equal parts embarrassment and denial. Some insisted it was necessary. Others called it a grotesque misuse of national resources. One member reportedly asked, "Could we not have simply closed the gates?" Ah, yes, the eternal wisdom of hindsight. The soldiers, for their part, bore it all with stoic resignation. They returned from the fields, their faces sunburnt, their pride shredded like wheat chaff. People teased them. "So, did you get the birds?" And they would nod, smile faintly, and then change the subject. But here's the beautiful thing about humanity. When faced with humiliation, we eventually turn it into art. Or, failing that, comedy. The Great Emu War started to take on mythical proportions. People began retelling it at dinner tables, adding details, exaggerating for effect. Some said the emus had outflanked the army in a coordinated maneuver. Others claimed the birds could dodge bullets by instinct. There was even a rumor, completely untrue, but too delightful to ignore, that the emus had somehow learned to recognize uniforms and would scatter the moment they saw cocky. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. What mattered was that the story had transformed. It was no longer just about birds and bullets. It was about hubris and humility, civilization and chaos, the eternal comedy of human plans gone wrong. Historians later called it a symbol of absurd imperial overreach. But for ordinary Australians, it was something simpler, a hilarious cautionary tale. You could almost hear the moral, whispered by the wind across the wheat fields. Don't start a war with something that doesn't even know it's fighting you. Because really, the emus weren't at war. They weren't strategizing, plotting, or scheming. They were just doing what emus do, eating, running, living their big bird lives. They didn't know they were the villains in anyone's story, and maybe that's why they won. You can't defeat something that doesn't even care about your victory conditions. If you zoom out, And this is the kind of thought that drifts through a sleepy mind. In the middle of the night, you start to see the Great Emu War as a kind of cosmic joke. On one side, modern humans, with their machines, hierarchies, and paperwork. On the other, a bunch of large, bewildered birds. The outcome, predictable dot because the universe. It seems has a sense of humor dot. It lets us invent marvelous things. Radios, airplanes, machine guns, and then reminds us that all it takes to undo us is a creature with strong legs and zero respect for human authority. And maybe that's why people still tell this story. Because it's not just funny. It's profoundly, deeply human. It's about trying too hard, failing spectacularly, and somehow laughing about it anyway. That's the spirit of history, really. A long parade of triumphs and disasters, all equalized by time and irony. And in that sense, the Great Emu War isn't just a footnote. It's a mirror held up to every grand scheme that ever fell apart under its own weight. So, as we drift a little deeper now, imagine the quiet of that Australian plain at dusk. The soldiers gone, the field still, and in the distance, a single emu silhouette against the setting sun. Tall, proud, utterly undefeated. Its head turns, briefly, then it walks away. Because for the emus, the war was never over. It just never mattered. Time, as it often does, turned tragedy into farce, and farce into folklore. The Great Emu War, that most feathery of national embarrassments, slowly drifted out of newspapers and into legend. And then, many decades later, the internet found it. And like all ancient relics rediscovered by online archaeologists, it was given new life, new memes, and an absolutely undeserved amount of enthusiasm. It's funny how history works. Some wars get statues, memorials, solemn ceremonies. The Emu War got Reddit threads, ironic t-shirts, and YouTube videos titled things like "When Birds Beat Tanks." Australia, of course, leaned into it. You can't really live on a continent where everything wants to kill you, spiders, snakes, sun, and not have a sense of humor about it. So the Emu War became part of that grand national tapestry of absurd survival. Right next to drop bears and spiders the size of dinner plates, there sits the time the military lost to a flightless bird. There are plays about it now, parody documentaries, even a metal band or two that names songs after it. Because nothing says epic tragedy like screaming lyrics about emus to distorted guitars. But underneath all the laughter, the story still whispers something curious, something oddly comforting. It's the reminder that failure, even spectacular, bird-related failure, can be beautiful in its own ridiculous way. The Emu War wasn't a story of cruelty or conquest. Nobody died in glory. Nobody conquered anything. It was just a bunch of humans trying to fix a problem in the most overcomplicated way possible. And that, my dear dreamers, might be the most relatable part of all. Because we've all been there, haven't we? Maybe not literally chasing birds with a machine gun, but metaphorically trying to solve a simple issue with an elaborate plan that goes catastrophically wrong. You overthink it. You overdo it. You realize halfway through that you could have just built a fence. And yet, years later, you tell the story at parties and everyone laughs. And somehow it becomes one of your favorites. That's what the Emu War is for Australia. A story that says, we messed up magnificently, but at least it was memorable. Historians sometimes try to analyze it seriously. They'll talk about post-war agriculture, rural economics, the struggles of ex-soldiers adjusting to life in the outback, and they're not wrong. All of that matters. But the soul of the Emu War isn't in policy or logistics. It's in the image of a soldier standing on a truck, gun jammed, staring at a bird that refuses to take him seriously. That's humanity distilled. And so, the legend endures in classrooms, in comedy shows, in the half-whispered retellings between Australians who can't quite believe it happened, but love that it did. Because what makes it timeless isn't the war itself, it's the laughter that came after. There's something wonderfully healing about laughing at your own disasters. It's a way of reclaiming dignity, not through denial, but through absurd acceptance. Yes, you say, we really did that. And yes, it was ridiculous. But wasn't it glorious? And that, perhaps, is the real moral of the Great Emu War. That sometimes the most human thing you can do is fail spectacularly, and then tell the story beautifully, of course. The emus don't care about any of this. They don't read history books. They don't scroll through. Men's about themselves. Somewhere out there, their descendants are still wandering across the Australian plains, pecking at seeds, completely oblivious to the fact that they once defeated an entire army. Which feels perfect, doesn't it? The victors of the world's strangest war are blissfully unaware they even fought one. And maybe that's the universe's final wink. That nature doesn't need recognition. It doesn't need parades or medals or historical validation. It just is eternal, chaotic. Meanwhile, humanity writes essays about it, makes jokes, records podcasts. We build museums for our triumphs and bedtime stories for our failures, because we, unlike the emus, need meaning. We crave narrative. We can't just let something be absurd. We have to give it shape, purpose, poetry. And so we take this ridiculous bird war and turn it into an allegory about ourselves. It's about our pride, our overconfidence, our ability to laugh in defeat. It's about how even when we stumble, even when we look absolutely foolish, we keep going, we keep trying. Because if there's one thing humans do better than emus, it's persistence through embarrassment. And so the Great Emu War lives on, not as a cautionary tale, but as a bedtime comfort, a reminder that the world is strange, history is hilarious, and failure, if told with humor, can be oddly soothing. And if you're drifting now, halfway between consciousness and dream, picture that endless Western Australian sky again, the heat shimmering, the fields quiet, and one solitary emu pausing for a moment, as if remembering something funny before disappearing into the distance. A bird, utterly undefeated, a human story, eternally absurd, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of laughter. If you listen closely, very closely, you can almost hear the faint hum of the 20th century waking up. Machines grinding, telegraphs clicking, radios whispering. The age of progress. They called it. Humanity was mastering everything. Air, sea, atom, and now, apparently, paltry dot, it was an era of supreme confidence. If you could build a dam across a river, you could probably outsmart a bird, right? But the Great Emu War happened right in that fragile space between pride and panic. The moment when humanity's shiny new inventions met the stubbornness of the natural world. It was supposed to be easy, guns versus birds. Yet it became a comedy that whispered a quiet truth the modern world didn't want to hear. That for all our machinery, nature still laughs last. Because there's something deeply symbolic about that. Dry wheat belt in Western Australia. A place where the soil was scraped thin by colonial ambition. Where settlers tried to plant the European dream in red dust and called it civilization. And out of that dust came the emus, unimpressed, unstoppable, eating the dream one stalk at a time. They didn't hate the farmers. They didn't care about empire or industry. They just existed. And that existence was enough to undo the illusion of control. It's the kind of story that makes you chuckle at first. And then, when you think about it long enough, makes you sigh. Because it's not really about birds at all. It's about our endless attempt to order chaos. To turn the wild into something that follows rules. And the universe, like an emu, simply blinks at us and runs away. You can almost imagine Major Meredith, years later, sitting on his porch somewhere, staring out at the horizon, wondering if maybe those birds were trying to tell him something. Maybe that all wars are absurd in their own way. Maybe that victory is just an illusion we paint over the moments. When chaos pauses to catch its breath. In that sense, the Great Emu War wasn't a failure. It was a prophecy. Because the rest of the century would be full of big machines fighting. Small, stubborn things. Tanks against mountains. Empires against peasants. Progress against reality. And time after time, the small, stubborn things would win. It's as though the emus set the tone for modern history. A reminder that arrogance makes a terrible battle plan. And yet, we keep trying. We can't help it. We're a species that loves building towers, drawing maps, and assigning meaning to everything. We don't just live in the world. We try to edit it. So when something refuses to be edited, when it just is, it unsettles us. Maybe that's why the Emu War lingers in our imagination. Because it represents the one thing we can't conquer, the absurd. There's a kind of peace in that. Actually, the idea that somewhere, even now, there are things we'll never control. Things that remind us we're not the center of the universe. We're just one of its funnier experiments. And for a channel like this, Sleepy Dreamer in America, that's the perfect lullaby thought. That the world is both ridiculous and magnificent. That even our failures can sparkle softly in the moonlight of memory. Because, in the end, the Emu War wasn't tragic. Nobody wrote epic poems about it. No great monuments stand to honor the fallen. It was just absurd, gloriously, wonderfully absurd. And in that absurdity, there's something very human. When we mess up, when our machines fail, Our plans collapse, and the birds outrun us. We laugh. We adapt. We build fences. We move on. The emus didn't mean to teach us humility, but they did. And somewhere, in that dusty field, under the relentless sun, maybe that's what the wind still carries. Not the sound of gunfire, but the soft chuckle of history itself. It says, "Don't take yourself so seriously, little human. You're doing fine. But maybe next time, use a fence." And that's all history really is, isn't it? A long collection of stories where we tried something ridiculous, learned something small, and pretended it was part of the plan all along. The Great Emu War may have been a failure, but it's the kind of failure that redeems itself by being unforgettable. So, when you close your eyes tonight, imagine that strange Australian sky again, stretching endless and gold. Picture the soldiers packing up, their trucks rumbling away, the dust settling behind them. And then, in the quiet, the emus appear once more. Dozens of them, hundreds, moving in a line like ghosts of the earth itself, unbothered, unstoppable. Ancient. No medals, no monuments, just motion. Nature's quiet reminder that sometimes the wisest victory is to walk away. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of every ridiculous story, where laughter turns into a kind of quiet understanding. The Emu War reaches that point too, when you stop snickering about machine guns and birds, and start thinking, oh, this is actually kind of profound. Because underneath the slapstick, it's a story about forgiveness. About what happens after you've been humiliated by life, or, in this case, by birds, and you have to decide whether to stay angry or just laugh. Australia, being Australia, chose laughter, which, let's be honest, is a heroic choice. When your entire national army fails to outsmart emus, you can either bury the story deep in classified archives, or you can say, yeah, that happened, and make it part of your national personality. And the Australians did it perfectly. They transformed failure into folklore. They took the sting out of it by owning it. That's the thing about absurd history. It teaches you how to be okay with imperfection. The Great Emu War reminds us that sometimes the most mature, enlightened, Zen-like thing you can do is shrug and say, well, that was stupid. And there's something incredibly soothing about that. Because how often do we fight our own emu wars? Maybe not literally, though if you've ever tried to assemble IKEA furniture, you've probably come close, but metaphorically. You put all your effort into something that refuses to cooperate. You bring your biggest tools, your best logic, your bravest intentions, and the universe responds with the emotional equivalent of a bird, sprinting away at 30 miles an hour. And what do you do then? You can rage, or you can laugh. The Australians laughed. They told the story again and again, until it became a lullaby for humility. And isn't that what makes history soft and bearable in the end? It's not the wars we win that define us. It's the ones we survive long enough to laugh about. The Great Emu War has that kind of healing absurdity to it. It's not a story of victory or defeat. It's a story of perspective, Because if you zoom out far enough, everything starts to look a little bit silly. Empires crumble, borders shift, kings fall, and somewhere in the background, a bird keeps walking. Life goes on. The Earth doesn't care who won. In that sense, the Emu War is the perfect bedtime story for humanity. It says, don't worry so much. The birds are fine. The wheat will grow again. The soldiers will go home. The world will keep spinning, gently amused by your effort. And that's comforting, isn't it? To realize that failure doesn't end the story, it just gives it personality. Even Major Meredith, the man who led the campaign, seemed to understand that eventually. He became a sort of accidental philosopher, quoted in articles for years afterward. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, he said, it would face any army in the world. That's not bitterness. That's admiration disguised as humor. The best kind of wisdom. And maybe that's what the emus taught everyone in the end. That strength doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it looks like an emu ignoring all the noise, doing its own thing, absolutely uninterested in the drama of mankind. There's an odd piece in that image. Imagine standing on that field after everyone's gone. The air is still. The sun is dropping low, painting the ground in honey-colored light. And from somewhere far away, you hear the faint drumming of emu feet, hundreds of them, moving in slow, deliberate rhythm, like the heartbeat of a continent. That's history too. Not the kind in textbooks, the kind that doesn't care whether you win or lose, the kind that keeps going, quietly, under everything. And that's where the Great Emu War belongs. In that gentle, absurd place between human pride and nature's calm indifference. It's what makes it funny, yes, but also oddly beautiful. Because if the universe can forgive humanity for trying to machine gun birds, maybe it can forgive you for your own small mistakes to dot, so the next time you feel defeated, or embarrassed, or stuck in your own personal emu war, remember this story. Remember that even when your plans fall apart spectacularly, you're in good company. You're part of a long, glorious tradition of humans doing their best and getting outsmarted by the universe in hilarious ways. And if Australia can survive that kind of public failure and turn it into a national joke, then you can survive your bad Tuesday. Because if there's anything this story teaches us, it's that defeat can be funny. And funny defeats are the kind you can live with. Now breathe. The field is quiet. The sky is endless. The birds have gone. Only the memory remains. Light, absurd, and oddly kind. So here we are. The end of the Great Emu War. Or maybe the beginning of something better. The part where the laughter settles into a sigh. And the story stops being about birds and starts being about us. Because when you strip away the machine, guns, the reports, the embarrassment, what you're left with is something strangely pure. A reminder that humanity, for all its cleverness, is still hilariously fallible. It's comforting, isn't it? To know that even nations, with all their flags and budgets and committees, can trip over their own shoelaces in front of the entire world and still keep going. There's a quiet kind of grace in that. The Great Emu War wasn't glorious, or tragic, or noble. It was silly, utterly, profoundly silly, and that's what makes it so special. Because history tends to be heavy, wars and plagues and revolutions. But every now and then, it gives us something light, something that reminds us we're not just builders and fighters. We're also bumbling, occasionally ridiculous creatures who can turn disaster into folklore. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. You can almost imagine it, can't you? Somewhere in the afterlife of absurd ideas, the ghosts of all, history's blunders gather around a cosmic campfire. Napoleon's there, shaking his head about Russia. Some Roman general is muttering about that one time he misread a map. And then Major Meredith walks in, dusts off his boots, and says, "Gentlemen, let me tell you about the birds." The room goes quiet. Someone pours him a celestial beer, and as he starts describing the chaos of Western Australia, the laughter builds, because even among history's giants, losing a war to emus is hard to top. That's the beauty of it. Even failure can become a gift. If you're willing to laugh at it long enough. The emus, of course, never knew any of this. They didn't care about the symbolism. They didn't understand the headlines or the mockery or the philosophical implications. They just kept doing what emus do, walking, eating, living. And maybe that's the secret to everything. Keep walking. While we sit here, overthinking the meaning of life, the birds already figured it out. They just move forward, quietly, relentlessly, without apology. And maybe that's what the Great Emu War was really about. Not man versus bird, but overthinking versus being. We humans try so hard to make everything important, to control, define, improve, optimize. The emus don't care. They just are dot, and that's why. In the end, they won. Not because they were stronger, but because they didn't play the game. They refused to be enemies. They refused to understand the concept of war. And in doing so, they broke the logic of the entire situation. That's a kind of enlightenment. A very tall, very fluffy kind of enlightenment. And so, as the world turns and the years pass, the Great Emu War remains. Not a tragedy, not even a proper embarrassment anymore, but a parable, a soft, laughing whisper that says, "Calm down. You don't have to win everything. You just have to keep going." That's the lesson, tucked quietly beneath the feathers and the folly. And if you listen closely, if you let your mind settle into that drowsy half-dream, where history feels like a story told just for you, you can almost hear the emus again. The soft thud of their feet on the earth, the dry wind moving through the grass, the gentle, absurd heartbeat of the world itself, reminding you that everything, even failure, is part of the rhythm. Somewhere out there, the descendants of those birds still wander through the fields. The stars above them are the same ones that watched the soldiers leave in defeat. The earth below them still carries the echo of laughter. It's all still here. The comedy, the irony, the quiet peace that comes after. And if you're drifting, now, eyes heavy, the story's still humming faintly in the back of your mind. Remember this. Not every war is worth winning. Not every mistake is worth regretting. Sometimes the best thing you can do is laugh, forgive yourself, and build a better fence. Because in the grand, ridiculous history of our species, even the silliest moments matter, especially the silly ones. And somewhere, in the deep calm of the night, the emus keep walking beneath the moon, undefeated, unaware, perfect in their simplicity. The war is over. The world is fine. You can rest now. Sleep well, dreamer. History's got this one covered.